Welcome back. For this lecture, we're going to talk about metabolism for EMS. Metabolism in its most basic form is the process of taking chemical energy from food, fats, carbohydrates, and others, converting that into adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate is the product that we use for energy. It is the unit of energy in the body for which all processes are facilitated. Anything that requires energy requires adenosine triphosphate. That includes moving your muscles, having your heart contract, ventilation. Every process requires adenosine triphosphate. Now, when we talk about cellular metabolism, cellular respiration, we oftentimes get overwhelmed with looking at things like glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle that's occurring within the mitochondria of the cell. You might have seen graphics where we see tons of biochemical processes and chemistry names and all of these reactions that occur, and frankly, it gets a bit overwhelming. For EMS, we do need to understand this process, but we can simplify some of these components to make them a little bit more digestible and arguably a little bit more relatable. So let's take this same process and simplify it down just a little bit here. Through the next couple of slides in the next few minutes, I'm going to present an argument to you that I hope by the end that you can appreciate and understand why metabolism and cellular respiration and this process of production of ATP is indeed so important to us in medicine. I'll argue that cellular respiration and the production of ATP is life, and if we don't have this process of production of ATP, our patients are dead. Looking at this diagram, you'll start to see some familiar terms that we use in EMS, and this will help us sort of break down and understand what relevance this has in our field of practice. The input for glycolysis is glucose. That should be a familiar term. It's something we've seen before in medicine and in EMS. The input for the electron transport system, one of the inputs that's required is oxygen. And the byproducts of the Krebs cycle and electron transport system are carbon dioxide and water, both of which are things that we're familiar with. I'm going to introduce a concept now, and we'll talk more about it in a moment, but we can see that we can still produce some ATP through glycolysis without oxygen. This is a term known as anaerobic respiration. And when we add oxygen, we can move the pyruvic acid into the Krebs cycle and further create additional ATP, significantly more, 36 ATP in fact, with the use of oxygen, and that will be aerobic metabolism. So let's look at some of the inputs into the system. We've got glucose. Glucose goes into glycolysis. Glycolysis produces 2 adenosine triphosphates and then produces pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid moves into the Krebs cycle, into the mitochondria of the cell, where oxygen is added, and through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system, 36 additional ATP are produced with byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. There's one more component that's essential for us to be able to understand. These things don't occur in the vacuum, and we have to ensure that glucose is getting into the cell. We have to make sure that oxygen is getting into the cell, and likewise that carbon dioxide and water are able to move about and be excreted appropriately. So we also have the cellular respiration superhighway, where things are moved throughout the body. This is our circulatory system. Let's talk about some of the familiar errors in metabolism that can occur. We've often heard terms like hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia or diabetes. And we can see where this error in metabolism of a lack of glucose being available could pose significant problems. If glucose can't enter the cells for glycolysis to occur, we can't produce the products needed to engage in the rest of the functions within the body. We don't have ATP, our heart stops beating, our brain stops working, things begin to diminish quickly. Without oxygen coming into the system, we can't produce adequate amounts of adenosine triphosphate. States like hypoxia or airway compromise or hypoventilation prevent the utilization of oxygen and only produce a limited amount of adenosine triphosphate and create an overload of pyruvic acid in that anaerobic metabolism phase, the glycolysis phase. We need oxygen to conduct aerobic metabolism to ensure an adequate production of adenosine triphosphate so that we can supply the body with its necessary energy. Perfusion errors can also prevent the materials getting to and from the cells that they need to. So things like cardiac arrest, hypovolemia, states of shock, hypoperfusion. All of these elements have to come into play so that we can produce the adenosine triphosphate that's needed for the body to engage in its normal functions. And we can assess each of these, and we do assess them in medicine and in EMS. We can assess the inputs to metabolism by looking at things like a patient's blood glucose level or the patient's SpO2, saturation percentage of oxygen. And we can test the outputs of metabolism and cellular respiration by evaluating a patient's end-tidal CO2 or urinary output.